Hello, dear friends. This is my second attempt. First one didn't work. To talk about the Parsha of Tazria. These ideas sort of connect to Tazria and Metzora together. If you know that sometimes these Parshiot are put together in Leviticus, in Vayikra, and sometimes they are apart, like on a leap year that it is this year. But because one of the common topics of these parshiot is what they call tzara'at, which is the Hebrew for the biblical leprosy. Now, I purposely call it the biblical leprosy because the leprosy which is talked about in the Torah, in Vayikra, is not the dermatological disease of leprosy that we know today or that was known even in antiquity. It's a very strange type of disease. Well, for one thing, it can happen on a person or on clothing or on the house. So it's definitely not a dermatological disease. And secondly, when you do get it, you don't go to the doctor. The Kohen, the priest, comes to the house and he tells you, he looks at it based on that, how long you have to be in seclusion, in quarantine, etc. Why would you have the priest come and not the doctor? The Talmud says that this unusual type of disease called leprosy of the Torah was caused because of gossip and slander that somebody said against another person. Now, it seems like an interesting idea, but is there any evidence for this? Actually, there is. In two places in the Torah. Number one, the famous case of Miriam. In the book of Exodus, Miriam and Aaron are speaking about Moses, about the Cushite woman that he had, according to one interpretation of Rashi, that he had left. Rashi explains he had left Zipporah, his wife, but that's a discussion by itself. But the point is they were talking about Moses, gossiping about Moses, and then God appears to them all of a sudden, and at the end of this discussion, Miriam becomes leprous, with leprosy. And Moses says to God, El Narafanala, you have to heal her. Don't let her be like a child coming out of her mother's womb, half dead. Look at the way she looks. And then God listens to Moses, and she is healed. But it's interesting, she gossiped about Moses, and her punishment was that she would be leprous. And then she had to stay for 7 days outside of the Israelite camp. The second proof of this is Moses himself. When Moses, at the beginning of the book of Exodus, at the burning bush, God says to him, you're going to show these signs to the elders of Israel. Now, why did he tell him you have to show signs to the elders of Israel? Because Moses said to God, Heim lo yaminu li. The elders of Israel won't believe me. He didn't have a problem with Pharaoh because he knew Pharaoh very well. But he said, the elders are not going to believe me. They don't know me. I wasn't in slavery with them. God says, you'll show them the signs and they will believe you. And what were the signs? If you remember, sign number one was Moses takes his staff and throws it down, turns into a serpent, then he picks it up, it becomes a staff again. Number two was Moses takes his arm and puts it into his bosom and takes it out, and it's leprous. And then he puts it again, and it's not. And number three is that Moses takes water from the Nile, and when it hits dry land, it turns into blood. Rashi brings the Midrash there and says, sign number two was a punishment for Moses. Why did his arm become leprous? Because he had gossiped and said something bad, slanderous about the Jewish people that they're not going to believe him. So he deserved to be leprous. In both cases, whether according to the Midrash or according to the simple meaning of the story with Miriam, this leprosy, this biblical leprosy happens because of gossiping and slander. And this is the way the Talmud understands the whole concept of biblical leprosy. Now, the unusual thing is that even though the Torah says when you come into the land, this is what you're going to do, it's not clear that there ever was biblical leprosy in the First Temple period or even before the First Temple period. Maybe it was at the beginning with Joshua, where there is no evidence of such, but maybe. It definitely the First Temple, it definitely was not, because the two cases of leprosy, which are mentioned, by the way, in the Hafthor of Tazria and the Hafthor of Metzora, are taken from the Book of Kings. The one on Tazria is Kings 2, chapter 4. The one on Metzora is Kings 2, chapter 7. The first case is about a fellow by the name of Naaman, who was the chief of staff of the army of Aram. Aram is the area of Syria today, and they were an arch enemy of the northern kingdom of Israel, and not exactly friendly with the southern kingdom either. And by the way, that already shows it's not the biblical leprosy, because he had it his whole life. This Naaman, he was leprous in the story. He had it his whole life, and he wasn't Jewish. That had nothing to do with the biblical stories with the Israelite nation. So it seems that Naaman had the dermatological disease of leprosy and not the biblical disease. And also in Kings 2 and 7, when the army of Aram comes to the southern kingdom of Judea, there are 4 lepers who are outside the city walls, and they realize that God smote or did something, that the angel of God made all the Arameans run out of their encampment and run home. And these 4 lepers see this, and they realize we have to tell somebody, but they were living outside the city. It wasn't at all like the biblical story. They appear to be having the dermatological disease of tzaraat, of leprosy. Well, so was there ever the biblical leprosy? Who knows? Maybe not. Maybe it was what the Talmud calls drosh v'kabel sachar. Study it and you receive a reward from studying it because it teaches you things. But maybe it actually never happened in actuality. You know, they once asked the Chafetz Chaim, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Cohen, in the early 20th century Lithuania, said to him, how come the Talmud says that in biblical times, if somebody said slanderous things or gossip against somebody else, they became leprous, but today it doesn't happen. So the Chafetz Chaim says, today it happens too, you just don't see it. Which means that there's a certain sensitivity about there are things that you can say against others that changes you, that you don't realize it. But if you're very sensitive, you can realize it about somebody's character. So let me tell you this story. I want to read you the story of the Hafthor of Tazria, because it's really quite a story. I'll start, but there are other things I have to explain in order to explain the story. The story starts like this. The Naaman, this fellow Naaman, was a chief of staff for the king of Aram. Again, Aram is the Hebrew word for the biblical Syria. And he was a great man in his country, and he was honored by his master because God gave him salvation to Aram. And he was a great warrior, but he was leprous. And Aram had gone and encamped in Israel, northern Israel, and they came back with a young woman who became the maiden to Naaman's wife. When did all that happen? Let me tell you when it happened. There's a story at the end of Kings 1. And the story is the king of Achav, the king Achav of the northern kingdom of Israel, who lived at the time of Eliyahu. And Achav was having difficulties with Aram, and Aram were making him difficulties and asking for head tax and things like that. Eventually, in 722, which is going to happen later, before the Common Era, Aram will actually, well, not just Aram, but Assyria together with Aram, but it's mostly Assyria, will exile the northern kingdom. But Aram was fighting the northern kingdom all the time. And the story is that Achav asked the king of Judah, Yehoshaphat, to join him in a battle against Aram. And Yehoshaphat says, okay, we know this guy, he's not great, why not? So what happens is that in order to go to battle, of course, the kings asked the prophets. So Achav, the king of the northern kingdom, who wasn't the greatest king, he asked his 400 yes men prophets. We know they're also the prophets of the Baal, not exactly the best prophets. And they also go and be victorious against Aram. Don't worry, everything will be fine. And then Yehoshaphat from Judea, a more believing man, he says, maybe there's a prophet of the one God here that we can ask his opinion. Achav says, yeah, there's a guy, his name is Michael ben Imlabed, he doesn't like me. So Yehoshaphat says, let's bring him anyhow, let's just hear what the guy has to say. So Michael comes, and Achav says, okay, speak. Michael says, Achav, go and be victorious. Achav looks at Michael and says, okay, Michael, how many times did I tell you not to lie to me? Now tell me the truth. So Michael looks at Achav, he says, okay, I'll tell you the truth. In my vision, I saw the heavenly court and God sitting with the angels. And he said, who is going to deceive Achav that he should fall in the battle? And the wind came and said, I will do that. I will be the wind and the lies in the mouths of all his yes men prophets, all his prophets, Nevi'eh Sheker, prophets of lies, and they will tell him to go and he will fall in this battle. And so, and then Achav says to Michael, I don't want to see you again. And Michael says to Achav, if you see me again, that means I was a false prophet. And then Achav gets very nervous and turns to Yehoshaphat and says, Yehoshaphat, do you mind? I have an idea. Let's switch our royal garb. You wear my royal clothing, I'll wear yours. Maybe I'll somehow come out alive out of this. Yehoshaphat says, okay, fine. Anyhow, the battle happens against Aram. And actually somebody sees the garments of the king of Israel, and Aram didn't like the king of the northern kingdom of Israel. But when he comes close, he sees it's the wrong guy. It's not Achav, it's somebody else, because it was Yehoshaphat. Yehoshaphat shouted, and they realized the wrong guy. Didn't know it was the king of Judea, maybe. And then it says somebody shot a bow from an arrow from a bow. And that arrow happened to hit Achav right in the back. And Achav was injured very heavily. And he turned to somebody who was helping him and said, look, I don't know if I'll make it through. I want you to hold me up during the battle so that the soldiers don't despair during the battle. Please hold me up, which he did. And the battle was over. Achav died. Who was that person, the Talmud says, the anonymous person who happened to shoot the arrow that killed Achav? That person was Naaman, the chief of staff of the army of Aram. He is the person. And he is this person with leprosy who's in our story. And he's the one in that battle who was able to bring this young woman from the land of Israel as the maiden for his wife, because he took her into captivity. So this young woman says to Naaman's wife, your master, meaning your husband, should go see the prophet in Shomron in the northern kingdom, because this guy, his name is Elisha ben Shaphat, he can do wonders and he can get rid of this leprosy. So she told her husband, and this is what the young girl said from the land of Israel. So then the king of Aram, they took this already to the king. He said to Naaman, I'll give you an official document, official letter. You take this to the king of Israel, and also bring him some silver and gold, and also some garments. So he brought the royal letter to the king of Israel. And when the king of Israel, which must have been Yehoram, the son of Achav, saw this and saw that he'd sent Naaman, the chief of staff, and asked that he be relieved of his leprosy. So the king of Israel said, he rent his garments, he tore his garments, and he says, am I God that I know how to take somebody out of leprosy? He says, this guy obviously is looking for a reason to come to battle against me. I can't do anything. But when Elisha, the prophet, heard that the king of Israel had torn his garments in despair, he sent a messenger and says, why are you tearing your garments? Let this guy know that there is a prophet in Israel. Why is that so terrible? So Naaman comes with his horses and with his entourage, and they come to the entrance of the house of Elisha, the prophet. Elisha does not go out, because Elisha does not like Naaman, because Naaman was the guy who shot the arrow, who killed the former king of Achav. So he doesn't like him, even though Achav was not the greatest of kings, but he was the king. So he sends a messenger to Elisha, and the messenger says, my master, Elisha, he sends a messenger to Naaman, and the messenger says, my master, Elisha, the prophet, said, you shall immerse yourself in the Jordan River 7 times, and that will take care of your leprosy. Naaman gets really angry. Not only this guy not even look at me to come and see me, but I thought, he says, he would come out and call out in the name of his God, and then start waving his arms back and forth and say some hocus pocus, and then miraculously, somehow my leprosy would disappear. That's what I thought would happen. But he's telling me what? To immerse in the Jordan River? Like in Damascus, we don't have rivers. We have Havana, we have Papar, we have lots of rivers. I don't need this. I'm going home. And he walks away in anger. But then some of his soldiers and his servants say, you know what? Maybe this prophet is saying something true. You never know. Maybe it's a code. Maybe it's something. Let's just do it. We came this far. He told you to go to the Jordan. Let's go to the Jordan. It's not so far away. So they took Naaman and he went into the Jordan and he immersed 7 times, just like the prophet said. And not only did the leprosy disappear, but his skin was like the skin of a young man. Nar Katon, almost like a child. And he decides to go back to pay his respects to the man of God, to Elisha the prophet. And he goes with his whole entourage, and they stand in front of the house. And this time Elisha comes out. And he says, I want you to know, O prophet, that I now know there is no God in all the land aside from the God of Israel. So please accept my humble present. Elisha says, by the life of God, I will not accept any present from you. Naaman says, please? He says, no, nothing. But Naaman says, well, what am I going to do with these things? Because I'm not going to bring it to the God of Aram, which I don't believe in anymore. I'm only going to give presents to God. Sorry. But then, just before he goes, Naaman says one thing. He says, one last thing I'd like to say. I want you to forgive me. I want to know that God forgives me in advance, because my master, the king of Aram, goes to Beit Rimon, which is our pagan god. And since it's a national ceremony, it's an official ceremony, I have to be there with him. When he bows down, he leans on me, so I sort of have to do that too. But I don't actually believe in it. So please, I'm asking in advance for forgiveness for this. Elisha says, go in peace, bye. The story continues, by the way. But in the Hafthor, they stop here at this point, where Elisha says goodbye and he leaves. But in the book of Kings 2, it continues a little bit. Gehazi, the right-hand man of the prophet Elisha, runs after this guy, Naaman, when he realizes that he brought all these presents and Elisha took nothing. And he catches up with him and he says, what happened? Is there a problem? Naaman says, Gehazi says, no, there's no problem. Just, I wanted to tell you that even though my master took nothing, but there are 2 young people who are studying to be prophets. and they don't have much. And I thought maybe if we can give them some suits and a little bit of silver to help them. So Naaman says, of course, I have plenty of it. Please take. He gives them something, and Gehazi goes back. Gehazi gets back, and Elisha says to him, Gehazi, where were you just now? Gehazi says, I didn't go anywhere. He says, Gehazi, I know where you went. You went to see Naaman. And now I'm going to tell you that the leprosy of Naaman will now be upon you to the end of your life. By the way, also in this story, Gehazi lied, made slander. Three things we can learn from this interesting story about Naaman, the chief of staff of Aram, and this meeting with Elisha. Number one, three things about religiosity and spirituality. See, Gehazi thought he's going to go to Elisha, and Elisha is going to wave his hands, call out to God, some incantation, hocus pocus, and then get rid of his leprosy. That's not what happens. You see, nobody can solve your spiritual problems for you. At the most, they can give you advice. Even a prophet will give you advice. A scholar will give you advice. A Kohen will give you advice. A rabbi will give you advice. But it's up to you in the end what you want to do with that. So it's not the hocus pocus. It's not the incantations. It's advice for what you should be doing. And then after you have that advice, what are you going to do with it? Because it's not somebody else who can do it for you. You have to immerse in the Jordan 7 times. You have to do something if you want to change yourself. So number one is that it's not the ability of somebody on the outside. Number two, you have to do something with that advice. You have to change yourself, make yourself into a better person. And the third thing is with the story of Gehazi, who asked for something. Elisha purposely did not want any presents. He didn't want to think that the word of God can be bought, that when you ask somebody to beseech God on your behalf, that you can buy them. There's nothing to be bought. When a person receives, by the grace of God, something in our lives which makes our lives better, that cannot be bought. You have to earn it. And you earn it by being a better person. And because Gehazi went out, had the audacity to go and ask for something, he ruined that lesson for Naaman, because that was the lesson that Elisha wanted Naaman to understand. You cannot buy things. You cannot bribe rabbis and prophets, and that the real people, there's no money that can pay for anything. They can give you the advice, then you have to earn it as a human being. Shalom, shalom.